O. Lesser time, baby. Ozo eze o. Country African boy. Ozo eze o.
What's up, y'all? I'm Lex-Jordan Ibegbu, and thank you for tuning into Wahala Talk. Today, we have a very special guest. We have a warrior, a fighter, a survivor, an attorney, an advocate, and a leader. North Carolina Senator, Ms. Sydney Batch. How are you doing, Sydney?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. It's been a crazy, busy schedule already at the General Assembly, but I am very happy to be here with you.
Oh, I can only imagine. We're in a very interesting time. So we'll get right into it. So you first ran, and correct me if I'm wrong, for the North Carolina House in 2018. So what made you want to do this selfless work?
It's a great question. So, as an attorney over the past 15 years, and I guess it was 13 in 2018, I was representing and continue to represent parents in our court system, both in the juvenile law area and in family law. And I found that I constantly was being approached and addressed with problems and challenges that so many families face, whether it be a good paying job, people separating and realizing that they had to try and raise their kids on one salary in their home and not having the ability to have a good paying job. People who were not fully educated and ready for the workforce, who may have stayed at home and taken care of their kids for long periods of time. And in the juvenile welfare space, a lot of families who just didn't have the resources that they needed in order to be in a position where they could take care of their children and address any mental health issues that they may have. So I finally decided that instead of being in a situation in which I can constantly try to push a ball uphill, I decided to go ahead and step forward and run for office, because as a social worker and as an attorney, there are policies that I know that would actually benefit families and working families in particular in North Carolina that weren't necessarily being addressed or at least elevated at the General Assembly level. And so I decided to be one of those voices. And that's why I threw my name in the hat in 2018 and ran for the North Carolina House.
I like it. So you've been a public servant for 4 years. So what has changed since the culmination of the pandemic and your reappointment to the North Carolina Senate in 2021 of this year?
Yeah, it was really challenging times, right? We have so many people who have lost loved ones, who have lost businesses, who have lost their jobs, a lot of grief over the past year that people are still trying to come out of because of COVID. It was interesting too, because running a campaign during COVID, right, has its challenges when the world is seeing the first time in at least over a century having to deal with a pandemic that we had never been experienced with. And so, starting out in 18, it was a very different session that we didn't have those challenges. But then when you overlay COVID on top of everything that's happened, what we found is that all the fissures and some of the issues in our systems that were broken were actually just amplified, right? Whether or not it's access to healthcare or paid leave for a lot of people who were sick and went to work because they didn't have a choice but to pay their bills, and went to work sick with COVID, or those who lost their jobs simply because they didn't have the ability to take paid leave off. All of these things have culminated to a point in which we as a state have to really wrestle and grapple with what is best and how we should move forward and promote policies and legislation that will actually assist families and North Carolinians to be prosperous.
Most definitely. So immediately prior to the pandemic, you were in the national spotlight due to your fight with breast cancer and the North Carolina Republicans trying to pass an anti-abortion bill, being very opportunistic while you were recuperating from surgery. So how was it going through this? And how was it experiencing the intersectionality of them trying to impinge on women's rights on the macro level, and then them also at the micro level trying to impinge on your rights as a woman to advance their own interests?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It was a very challenging time. I was diagnosed, as you said, breast cancer while I was actually campaigning in 2018, and then had the second mastectomy in May of that year. During that time, House leadership had decided, right, that the governor had vetoed an anti-abortion bill. It was brought to my attention that everyone knew. For the most part, I've been very public about my diagnosis. I've used that to go ahead and elevate the voices of those who don't have access to healthcare, right? I've always said I work for myself. We provide health insurance for our employees and for myself. And so I was very fortunate. I couldn't get fired from my job. I had healthcare. So I've always been very public about my experience, because I think we need to, of course, lift voices up and elevate those who have a lot of struggles and challenges. And so in that space, everyone for the most part knew in the building that I was actually going out and would be out for 3 weeks. That was my plan. Unfortunately, during that period of time, House leadership decided to go ahead and put the calendar of the veto override on the calendar. I found out and came in less than 2 weeks after surgery and came in for several days to make sure that I could sustain the governor's veto. It was a very important piece of legislation. Don't think that I could live with myself if I was in a situation where I stayed at home. And so while I physically struggled to come in, I thought that it was really important. And it was interesting, right? Just the dichotomy of having me as a woman recovering from breast cancer and dealing with all of those different challenges while still showing up and holding the line for women who need access to important healthcare coverage and access to make sure that their doctors can make decisions with them and that we keep politicians out of their personal business regarding reproductive rights. So it was definitely a life lesson. I will say that while there were a lot of members who were exceptionally supportive, there was one Republican member that stepped forward. Her name is Julia Howard. And Representative Howard walked up to me on the House floor on the third day I was there and said, "You go home. If leadership calls the vote again, I will walk off the floor and I will make sure that I cancel out your vote." And that meant a lot to me, right? I mean, it shows the humanity in certain individuals. Not everybody, right? My colleagues on across the aisle did that. She did. She was the only one. But I really respect her integrity in that regard because it's extremely important for us in our worst moments to have people step up and support you.
We have to view the humanity in all of us, especially in times like this, sadly, that is not apparent right now. Now, we know that North Carolina politicians at the state level don't make a lot of money. They only make $14,000. As a consequence, the overwhelming majority of those in the North Carolina legislature and the House and Senate are of the super rich economic class. So do you think this makes them out of touch with the average North Carolina voter?
It's a really great question. So, you have people from all walks of life. I think a good government is one that is represented by a diverse group of people, right? Our government should look like the people it serves. So we should have people who are very well off and in the business world. We should have farmers. We should have teachers. We should have everyone, right, in all of these different areas. The challenge, to your point, is that when you're a part-time legislature, but really it means full-time, right? Because we go into session on Monday nights and we usually don't get out until Thursday afternoons. You don't have but Monday day and Friday to be able to actually work a job. Educators need to be in the space in which we're talking about education. Unfortunately, most teachers can't just teach their students on Mondays and Fridays, right? So we find ourselves in a position where you don't have the people who actually know the most and have access to what's happening in the classroom level, right, in the legislature. So we do have some people, we have plenty of people with PhDs and with education and experience, but they've had to leave the classroom and come to the General Assembly and find a different profession. So, I think that it's set up for a situation where you do have a lot of individuals who are out of touch, don't necessarily know the people that are closest to the pain and understand how it is to have to live paycheck to paycheck. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have is that if you don't have that sense, right, if you don't meet people where they are, you don't have and understand the life experience of somebody else, it's very difficult to, of course, look at it through their lens and figure out policy that's going to actually help all of them. I think a rising tide lifts all boats. So if we're in a situation where we're really talking about helping the vast majority, we should start with the ones that have the least, and everyone else I think will thrive and do really well. Unfortunately, that is not always the case down at the General Assembly.
Understandable. A quick pivot before I go to my next question. As we saw with the Obama years, does a rising tide lift all boats or endemic wounds?
You're saying, does it?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that when you look at, especially in the healthcare space, right, when you're looking in a situation right now where, 800,000 North Carolinians don't have access to healthcare, right? If we expanded Medicaid, that amount would. If you look at the people who work every single day, their sweat equity is put in at businesses that thrive and are successful, but they cannot go ahead and get the treatment and the health care that they need, right? I had access, I had early intervention. I'm here today because I was able to get access to healthcare and was able to get treated for breast cancer. Not everybody has that. But if we actually gave people access to healthcare, and especially those who struggle with financially to get it, then it would lift all boats, because businesses it would cost less for them to, of course, provide insurance for their employees. And then those who are working, which are oftentimes called, the working poor, would it be able to, of course, go to work, be healthy, and not have all of the other issues and ailments that come along with underlying health conditions. And we've seen that in COVID, right? So many people who had all of these different underlying issues with COVID ended up getting much sicker and ended up dying. And so, yeah, I do think that there are certain policies in particular that if we just get to the root of where it is and address it with the vast majority of people, right, where they're the ones that are struggling to get access because of the financial issues, then everyone else will actually do better in the long run.
I understand. Now, speaking of the vast majority of people, with Biden's election in 2021, we saw hundreds of restrictive voter laws pass through every state within this nation. And North Carolina is no different and has a deep history with voter restrictions. And as of recently, the North Carolina House, I believe, has tried to bring forth a bill so as to tighten the window for absentee balloting. Now, what do you think the real reason behind these voter restrictions are?
I can't speak to my colleagues who are trying to change those laws and what's in their heart and what's in their minds. What I can say is that we live in a country where you should have access to the ballot box, and making reasonable recommendations, right, about postmarks, for instance. We can't control the mail, right? So one of the things that people talk about all the time is, if it's postmarked, it has to be delivered on the day to the, and it has to be delivered in the hands for it to count. Well, we understand that we can't control the mail. And what we saw, right, in the 2020 election was that the post office couldn't even handle the amount of mail given COVID and all the other challenges. And so when you're trying to deprive somebody of the right to use their voice, in which our country is founded on, right, the ability for you to be represented by who you choose, it's extremely problematic when we're looking at legislation that's trying to restrict that access, right, and to restrict early voting, et cetera. I think it's a way in which you are trying to suppress the vote of individuals that may not vote for you. And in the Democratic House, there are several Democrats, or in the North Carolina House of Representatives, there's several Democrats working to go ahead and try and improve the legislation that's currently, to your point, in the General Assembly, to move and to try and get changes to that language so that everyone's vote can actually count and they have access to the ballot box without undue restriction.
Definitely. Now, we see one of the divisive flashpoints in the Republican playbook nationally has been LGBTQIA rights, and specifically transgender rights. We see it in Florida with the genital inspection of minors, and now we see it with Senate Bill 514 with the restriction on transgender treatments for minors here in North Carolina. What is your stance on this issue?
Yeah. It's interesting. I was telling somebody that, with one of the restrictive bills that they wanted to move forward, and that, President Pro Tem Berger actually said that it will not move through the Senate, regardless of what happens in the House. And the anti-trans bills that have been in the Senate, they won't be calendared. They will not move through. I think that he did that, right, because we know that with HB2 and the bathroom bill, it hurt us financially in the state. There were businesses and corporations that were threatening to leave. There were opportunities where people would not come here, businesses, to go ahead and actually have their conferences or tournaments, et cetera. And we didn't need to return to a time in which we have a lot of those issues. Apple just announced this week that they are coming into Wake County and bringing 3,000 good paying jobs. I think that it's not coincidental, in my opinion, that you take the political headwinds and you figure out, if you want a large corporation like Apple, who is very pro LGBTQ rights, to go ahead and come out and say, we will not allow this to happen. We are not passing anti-trans legislation. But even in that, right, so we don't get it done, but there are people that I serve with who truly believe that this legislation needs to get passed. And that is really the challenge. And some of the issues that we're going to have over the years is, how do we work with individuals and make sure that we're protecting all of our trans and LGBTQ population and our fellow citizens and family members and siblings. And it breaks my heart, because when you think about the really terrible legislation that said that you had to wait until you're 21 in order to have gender affirming surgery, and that you couldn't get any type of medications with regards to hormone replacement, et cetera, until you're 21, that is, one, it's unconstitutional, right? Like, it's just unconstitutional. But two, what it's telling an entire group of citizens and loved ones and our fellow North Carolinians is you can't choose to be who you are. You can die for your country if you want to enroll in the military at 18, but you can't die in the body of which you identify with. They wouldn't be able to get that surgery. And it's just mind-boggling and heartbreaking that we're in a state in which there are people who are still rabidly opposed to making sure that people are able to identify and live in the bodies in which they choose. They act like it's a one-off and that there's a whole bunch of craziness going on, and they don't listen to science, and they don't listen to people who are, are in our trans community, who truly have so many other issues because of the way that society already makes it very difficult for them to live, right? They're not safer in their bodies. They are at higher levels of crime, suicide, et cetera, victims of crime, et cetera. Those are all the challenges that we face. And then you want to put something else on top of them that makes it that much worse. We have an issue with suicide in our teenagers already, and it's much higher in trans youth. And it's deplorable, in my opinion, for us to be in a position in which we are, which they're trying to promote legislation like that would be so harmful.
Now, you've been an advocate a fierce advocate at that, for women's equality. And one can infer that there is a seeming nexus between the attack on LGBTQIA rights and also women's rights, given the issue of control of one's own body. Now, do you see that there may or could be a political allyship that could cross gender, party lines, and economic lines, or will these schisms serve to be too high?
I mean, I think that with regards to political lines, it's a little bit more challenging, right? Because there are women that don't necessarily believe in supporting the Equal Rights Amendment, who are Republicans. So there are some issues that even among women, we can't agree upon. There are issues with regards to Republicans that are in the Republicans who are LGBTQ, right? But may or may not support certain pieces of legislation. I think what we fail to do is we fail to meet people where they are and try and to hear what they're saying and address whatever their issues, their concerns, their fears are. And so in order for us to get past these schisms, as you were talking about, especially in the political realm, we have to be in a position in which we decide here and now that we are not going to allow the media and the politics to get in the way of us trying to move our state forward and to support everyone. Doesn't mean that you have to, no one's asking that everyone has to believe in the same thing, but we can be respectful of people's humanity and be able to do that in a way where we're not allowing legislative, bills and statutes to come into play and really ruin somebody's autonomy to their own body and choose to go ahead and have oppressive laws that won't allow them to decide when they want to have children, how they want to have children, whether or not they want to identify and have, and love who they love and have gender affirming surgery. So again, I hope that we're at a place where we can actually bring humanity and compassion back into politics, but I do really fear that those are the wedge issues that are constantly thrown out there during elections because they get the most attention and they're the most divisive. I try very hard to make sure that I try to build consensus instead of throwing Molotov cocktails every 5 seconds at whoever just to go ahead and get a rise out of them.
When there was a humanity and compassion in politics, do you think it was only a guise or a veil to true feelings?
No, I mean, I think that when there was humanity, that there was, I feel like media, social media, the divisiveness of politics has demonstrated and has shown that while voters deserve better and while they deserve to know what you would do in office when elected, that is not what necessarily wins. People listen to the negative and they run toward that. And so the only way that we're going to change that is by having both parties, right? And there's libertarians and there's a Green Party. We have to have people in the political realm to say, I will be better, I will do better. I think that that's what happened in the past, that it's a far cry from where it was. And when you're asking people to go ahead and run for office, they have to deal with a lot of negative, press and media and sometimes lies. And it's hard because you want the best people to run and to serve, but so many are like, I don't want to deal with that. So until we as legislators actually lead by example, I don't think that it's going to change. I think that those days are past. I hope that they return. But I do wish that we could harken back to a time where they were much more respectful and that they had the art of being able to disagree without being disagreeable.
Understand. Now, the issue of education, kids have been out of school for too long, and we're seeing that a lot of kids are falling behind by no fault of their own. We see certain bills being set forth in the North Carolina House, like House Bill 82. But what can be done so as to bring up these kids who didn't necessarily have the monetary funds or the technological resources to stay afloat and to stay ahead in the school?
Yeah. It's a great question, right? So we have so many people that had no choice. They're essential workers. They were going to work. They had no choice but to go to work so that we all could benefit from still going to the grocery store and the pharmacy and the doctor's office and all the places that continue to, of course, keep society going during this pandemic. But those people have children, and those kids had to figure out how to navigate in a space where they were trying to figure out how to do their schoolwork without a parent necessarily being there. And even parents like myself and my husband, who our children were out, like so many other people, we don't know how to educate them, right? And we're still trying to work our own jobs. So you're trying to manage all of these different things. And the best of intentions and parents like myself and so many others who are, some are much more resourced than others, kids still were falling behind, right? And so we have to figure out programs and use the COVID money and the dollars that have come from the stimulus bill to be able to make sure that kids who have been left behind are able to catch up in summer programs, et cetera. And so there are bills that are moving through the legislature and one that passed that deals with some of that summer enrichment programs so that kids can have access. But we know it's not going to be 2 months to make up for the last year, right? We're going to have to do more. And we have to continually have this conversation with legislators, with people who are in the grassroots organizations, with educators, et cetera, to ensure that those children who have been harmed the most because of COVID through no fault of their own, as you mentioned, are able to continue to get the educational support that they need once they're back in school and throughout to catch them up, because a lot of children have lost almost a year of learning. But they're still going to be promoted to the next grade. So we are going to see for years to come the effects of the pandemic on so many children who really need a lot of academic support in order for them to be successful.
Definitely. Now, in the shadow of the Derek Chauvin trial, we saw in our own state the murder of Andrew Brown, and there are several issues with surrounding transparency in this incident, which are going on currently. Now, many people will say we want to reform the police, but what has reform done when we've been reforming for the past 50 years? Now the issue of defund the police has come up. Where do you stand on this?
Yeah. So what I will say is that, a lot of conversation, and in 2020, there was the whole, people want to defund the police and, oh, these Democrats are going to take the law enforcement away. What I know about people, including being a Black person, is that when I call, I want the police, like I want the police to be involved. I want them, if my house is broken into, if my child is assaulted, if something happens in my neighborhood or while I'm at work, I want the police to come. The difference is that people of color just want to feel like they can call the police and not then become a victim, right, of anything that happens to the police because of calling them. We want to be able to just know that I might not end up dying because I call the police. Those are the reality for brown people in America and with the challenges that we have in policing. There are a ton of wonderful law enforcement officers who unfortunately get a bad name with all of with some of the bad actors. And what we've seen is that law enforcement agencies across the state, including the governor's commission, that it was called the TREC Commission, they came out with recommendations about how we can actually improve policing. And some of that legislation is moving through. So I filed 2 bills this session actually about how we can look at policing differently, right? And talk about community policing and not necessarily having all of the, we don't need to militarize, right, the police. There are other techniques that work really well. So funding the appropriate programs and providing training to officers is extremely important. But you also need to be able to make sure that communities are safe and have buy-in and feel like they are part of that solution. And so taking our balls and going home in both corners with it, whether it's the defund the police or whether it's, a back the blue, people aren't listening. They're cross-talking and they're not paying attention, and they're not trying to figure out actual real solutions to policing. I don't pretend to be a genius in this area. It is not my wheelhouse. What I do know is that we need to have the police. We need to have law enforcement. We also need to make sure that it is equally it's equally administered, regardless of what you look like. And that's a challenge right now. That is what we see in the number of brown people who are losing their lives and being assaulted in police custody. And again, the vast majority of police want to do the right thing. That's why they got into it. But we have to figure out how we can hold accountable the bad actors who are making it extremely difficult and making us feel unsafe in dealing with some of the systematic issues within policing in order for us to move forward. With regards to the defund, I think that people don't necessarily understand what defund necessarily means. There's not a clear definition. I do think that there are opportunities where you put mental health professionals embedded in some of the units with regards to police and law enforcement when you're going to do a welfare check on somebody. I don't think that we need to have SWAT and tactical, gear and all of the other things that people use in policing, where honestly a lot of the funding comes from. We don't need to focus on that. That's not the priority. We need to figure out better ways to police and to bring people in the community so that we can feel safe. Because again, we all want somebody to come if something happens to our child. We just don't want to become a victim of any police brutality simply because of the way that we look while we're driving, or whether or not we call that the police while we're in our homes. So I hope that answers your question. And I've had the good opportunity of being supported by the Police Benevolent Association for the last 2 cycles. And that's because they know that I'm not just a rubber stamp for everything that law enforcement wants, but that I'm going to sit down and I'm going to try and work with them and work with our community partners on making sure that our communities are safe and respected, and that law enforcement has the right tools and resources in order to make sure that our communities are also safe and that they can respect the individuals that they serve.
So in what manners here in North Carolina can we establish this oversight and accountability?
That's a great question. So actually right now, Senate Bill 300 is moving through the Senate. It's a lot of legislation, including recommendations that were from the TREC Council with appropriate use of force or starting a database with regards to critical incidents, right? We don't have any of that right now. Now, of course, some of my colleagues would not agree to making some of those databases public. And we're going to have to fight back, and argue and negotiate what's going to be the best way in which we can ensure that we're improving policing in North Carolina. The challenge is I'm happy that conversation's out there. I'm happy that things are moving forward. I don't think it goes far enough, but we've got to start somewhere. And knowing the political headwinds that we're in, we have to go ahead and at least begin those conversations and get some legislation in, instead of just saying, if it's not what we absolutely want, then we're not going to negotiate and we're not going to talk. That is not how anything in the General Assembly gets through for the most part. And it's not going to help our communities who are desperately in need of working with law enforcement with the skills that they need in order to make sure that we're all safe.
Understandable. And lastly, you alluded to the fact that Apple is coming to Raleigh, coming to Wake County, Durham is coming to Google, and there are a slew of benefits that come with this development and these type of industries being placed in the area. Now, but there are some drawbacks. The housing demand is already high. It's not a bubble that's going to bust, but it's going to keep hiking up those housing prices. And we're only going to see that skyrocket with Apple and Google coming, which could lead to further gentrification, a higher rate of homelessness, and squeezing out working class families from historic neighborhoods. What can we do so as to maintain a manner in which North Carolina and Wake County and Durham County in particular are for all families and all individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're absolutely right with regards to the affordability of houses and that they continue to escalate. In Holly Springs, I think the average home value last year was $1,000, right? Who are those people? Where are the teachers? Teachers don't make enough to live in a $425,000 home. And to your point, all of these historic, like families of generations who are living in certain parts, whether it's being regentrified or in some of these towns, are being pushed out, whether it's 540 expansion coming through, and the government will give you the money that for your land, but you won't be able to turn around and necessarily buy a house in the same town in which you've grown up and that your grandparents grew up and your parents, et cetera. And so we have to figure out solutions on making sure that when we are displacing people, right, because through no fault of their own with regards to expansion of roads, et cetera, that we ensure that they have somewhere to go, and preferably in the town of which they already live. But also we have to come up with really creative solutions on making sure that we have affordability in a lot of the housing market. Again, I don't pretend to be an expert, but I have talked to several groups in towns that are doing a really good job. For instance, Apex, they've started, through, taxing in certain ways, they have a fund for affordable housing. So what they do is when a developer comes and says, hey, I want to build, they say, fine, in order for you to build, we're going to say we want houses to be at this price point, and we will waive the fees for X, Y, and Z, right? The parks and recs fees or whatever the builder's fees are. There's so many things. We'll waive the inspection fee so that the builder has the ability to come in, still have a very good price point for a house, but doesn't have to continue to increase the price in order to pay and offset all of the costs regarding permitting, et cetera. So there are places that are doing a really good job at this, or at least trying to, and starting that conversation because they understand that it is no longer affordable for the vast majority of working people to actually be able to get into home ownership and frankly to even afford an apartment in some of these areas. Wake County commissioners have actually worked really well at trying to figure out and identify land that they may own that they can turn over to a town, so long as the town promises that they're going to actually put affordable housing units up. And people think, oh gosh, it's going to be the projects, it's going to be X, Y, and Z. Now these are apartments that everyday people who might have a housing voucher because they work 2 jobs but don't make enough to pay $1,100 in a 2-bedroom apartment in Holly Springs can go ahead and actually live, right, in a wonderful and beautiful development, because they deserve to, just like everybody else, to be able to, of course, work where they live and live where they work. And that is increasingly not happening. At the state level, there's not an appetite for that right now with regards to trying to address this issue. And remember, to your point, this is happening only in certain areas. Most of North Carolina, their population is shrinking in their counties. There are other counties where it's expanding very rapidly, and that's where we're seeing the issues regarding housing. And so it's really incumbent on towns in the county to really sit down and figure out a much more aggressive and collective approach of how we're going to address housing and affordability. And so I think that it's much more on a granular level, on the local level. And we at the General Assembly, of course, can support their efforts. But right now, it's not politically something that is on the agenda of members in the General Assembly and leadership. And so we really have to rely on our local governments in order to be a partner with a lot of builders and other organizations who care about making sure that people can buy something that's affordable in their price range.
Definitely. Well, that's all I have. There's so many issues and we don't always know what the solution will be. But we're glad that we have people like you in elected positions who have a good heart and a sharp mind to move forward and continue the fight. I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I greatly appreciate it. And hopefully one day we can do this in person as the pandemic begin to slow down. But until next time, thanks for tuning in to Wahala Talk, and peace.
Country African boy.